Okay, hi everybody. We are very happy this afternoon to start with this new session, second seminar on cross views on security issues in the Americas. Today, I'm going to switch to French for a few minutes to introduce our session, and then I will let the floor to my dear colleague Camille to introduce our main speaker, Víctor Mijares. Donc, quelques mots en français donc, pour l'ensemble des personnes qui nous suivent cet après-midi pour ce deuxième séminaire donc, qui concerne les enjeux de sécurité dans les Amériques avec des points de vue croisés donc transatlantiques. Donc aujourd'hui, on est particulièrement heureux d'avoir Víctor Mijares qui nous vient de l'université de Los Andes en Colombie puisque qui en plus vient d'obtenir un poste de vice-doyen ou de directeur adjoint, Kevin, que tu confirmes cette semaine. Donc on est très heureux de l'avoir avec nous, avec un parcours qui est particulièrement transatlantique, puisque notre invité d'aujourd'hui est politologue, spécialiste des relations internationales, et il a obtenu un de ses diplômes donc, à l'université de Hambourg, en plus donc, de ses enseignements et de ses directions de master à Bogota. Il a un parcours incroyable avec un grand nombre de publications très récentes et qui sont particulièrement axées sur notre thématique et sujet du jour, à savoir les influences russes et chinoises en Amérique latine, avec peut-être un accent mis sur le Venezuela et la possibilité ou la porte ouverte à d'autres petites et moyennes puissances de pouvoir aussi faire valoir donc leurs intérêts stratégiques dans cette région. Donc on est très heureux d'avoir cette approche comparative aujourd'hui, avec deux discutants aussi, donc un de nos chercheurs IRSEM, spécialiste de la politique de défense de la Russie, Emmanuel Dreyfus, Antoine Bondaz, qui est spécialiste donc, de la Chine pour la fondation, à la FRS, et Maxime Audinet, qui sera aussi avec nous pour parler aussi des stratégies d'influence russes qui sont avec peut-être un point de vue comparatif Afrique-Amérique latine. Je passe tout de suite la parole à ma chère collègue Camille Boutron pour une petite introduction à notre et quelques mots d'accueil en espagnol à notre invité. Merci à vous tous.
Gracias, Maud. Buenas tardes para todos y todas. Estamos encantados de recibirlos y las para nuestra segunda sesión del seminario conjunto entre el IRSEM y el IDEA sobre las perspectivas transversales de seguridad en las Américas. Para esa segunda sesión tenemos el agrado de recibir a Víctor Mijares, que es doctor de la Universidad de Hamburgo, es politólogo, actualmente es profesor asistente en la Universidad de los Andes en Bogotá, en la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, donde también coordina la maestría de estudios internacionales. Víctor es especializado en relaciones internacionales y más particularmente se interesa en temas de política exterior y de seguridad global. Entonces, es particularmente pertinente para nuestra sesión de hoy, obviamente. En su trayectoria bastante diversa y impresionante, ha sido profesor e investigador en la Universidad Pontificia Javeriana en Bogotá, pero también en el German Institute for Global and Area Studies en Alemania o más bien en la Universidad Simón Bolívar en Caracas. Actualmente dirige un proyecto de investigación titulado Petroestados en la Política Mundial, donde aborda problemas en la definición y en la conceptualización de estados altamente dependientes de la exportación de hidrocarburos, así como sus estrategias de política exterior, seguridad y defensa. Tiene un montón de publicaciones, varias muy recientes, entre ellas figuran Filling the Gap, Geopolitical Links Explaining the South American Defense Council, en la revista Colombia Internacional, o, por ejemplo, otra como Paradox of Autonomy Explaining Flows in South American Security Regionalism, en la revista brasilera, si no me equivoco, Estudios Internacionales. Para discutir esta presentación tenemos el agrado de tener no uno, sino no dos, sino tres discutantes por una sesión que sin duda va a ser muy dinámica e interesante. Entre ellos Emmanuel Dreyfus, que es investigador del IRSEM, especialista de Rusia. También Máximo Diné, que también es investigador al IRSEM y con un foco más bien en el área de China. Y finalmente Antoine Bondas, que es investigador de la Fundación pour la Recherche Stratégique, me permito decirlo en francés por me parece más conveniente, que es especialista de China también, sabiendo que Maxime y Antoine seguramente van a abordar el caso desde dos perspectivas bien distintas. Entonces, muchísimas gracias para estar con nosotros esta tarde. Yo devuelvo la palabra a Maud y pues que disfruten el seminario. Gracias.
Many thanks, Camille. Victor, the floor is yours for 45 minutes, in 45 minutes, if you please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, Kevin told me that this is kind of, you know, open conversation with experts, and I think this is a great opportunity to share some general ideas in my presentation, my conference, and then we can go deep in some particular issues regarding Latin American relations with China and Russia. My presentation, my conference is mostly centered on Venezuela and the issue of Venezuela, and considering some other connections with Latin American countries. I don't have, I'm trying to not use the PowerPoint because I'm hating PowerPoint lately. So I will try, I have my writing presentation. If you don't, I'm much eloquent in Spanish than in English. So that's the reason why I will read my presentation and then we can discuss in English, in Spanish, not in French, of course, but thank you very much for having me here. So good afternoon. It is an honor to me to talk with you on a topic that's current and complex as the Chinese and Russian presence in Latin America in the 21st century. I want to thank the Institute of the Americas and the Institute for Strategic Research of the Ministry of Armed Forces of France for this invitation. I especially thank my colleague Kevin Paternay and Philippe Raffaneux. It will be a pleasure to share ideas with Emmanuel Dreyfus, Antoine Bondans, and Maxime Audinet, real experts about these Russian and Chinese issues. At the request of the organizer of this event, I have tried to prepare my presentation to be a cordial and fluid conversation, thinking about the subsequent exchange of ideas that will help us to refine the analysis. I prefer to have a writing conference not to deviate from my central arguments or mid points that could be useful for the further discussion. The content of my presentation is summarized like this. In the 21st century, China and Russia have approached to Latin America in parallel, but with different tactics and paces. The first and foremost explanation has been geostrategic, presuming that is due to a policy of balancing against the US. However, a complementary explanation is that both Eurasian powers are trying to obtain material advantages beyond a strategic positioning in the Americas. This double motivation is for rapprochement is combined with the increasingly open invitation from Latin American governments. The differences are perceived in how Beijing and Moscow look and act in the region, motivated by internal political logic. On the one hand, China's policy toward Latin America has been subject to leadership changes. On the other hand, Russia's policies have been linked to the selectorate dynamics that support Vladimir Putin's power group. The only apparent constant is that the Chinese and Russian presences are now part of the Latin American landscape. Furthermore, both great powers have become models for incursion of other Eurasian powers, risking further authoritarian learning and cooperation in the Americas. Well, a generation ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor of the United States during the Carter administration, took up the central thesis of the English geographer Sir Harford Mackinder to present that he believed should be the grand strategy of his country. Brzezinski wanted to extension of the American century beyond Charles Krauthammer unipolar moment to have the opportunity to continue to be the arbiter of the destinies of the world in the new century. Thus, Brzezinski did something that many political scientists often do when we want to impress large audiences, refurbishing other people's great ideas. But we cannot blame him entirely because there is not doubt that Mackinder's teaching continued to set the place in the learning of geopolitics in much of the world. I will sketch the part of that Brzezinski took from Mackinder. For the latter, where power rests on physical basis and consequently is distributed geographically. As physical geography is inconsistent, the distribution of global power and capabilities is also inconsistent, generating potential winners and potential losers in the competition between great powers. Thus, Mackinder made it clear that the world was unequal. Power lies mainly in a center that has defined as a heartland and an area that gives access to the pivot area that is better endowed with resources and is more defensible once conquered. This pivot area is located in the center of the great Eurasian continental mass, which encompasses all of Central Asia, Iran, and much of Russia. Outside of it is the inner or marginal crescent, which will include the rest of Eurasia and beyond of the other areas, which could include the British Islands, Southeast Asia, and Japanese archipelago. And beyond the rest of the world, including the Americas, will be the lands of the other or insular crescent. It is a straightforward approach to Mackinder. In this straightforward approach to Mackinder, it's clear that the Americas were irrelevant for the great English geographer. This statement may be tolerable for Latin America, but does it make any sense for a superpower like the United States? How can the arbiter of the world's destiny be geographically irrelevant? And the truth is, it is not. Mackinder's dismissive treatment of the America stands in a stark contrast with his modern achievement. If we want to continue reflecting geopolitically and strictly structurally, this may be since North America has its own pivot area, regional resources, land, and capable people. Jared Diamond's work on the continent's configuration from east to west or north to south tell us about this, not to mention Nicholas Spickman's thesis of the geohistorical contrast of the two Americas, northern and southern. But Brzezinski was not the first American to look to the British history for inspiration. In Alfred Mahan's case, it is an emblematic that he thought of power in structural and spatial terms, but based on the oceans. As most of you know, it is no coincidence that for more than a century, the United States has made enormous efforts to maintain control of the seas through a vast navy endowed besides with great powers and area of fire and an already legendary marine infantry. Thus, Washington's geopolitics Washington geopolitic thought has been that of the offshore balancer, a large-scale imitation of the British policy towards the continental Europe. The normality of this dominant geopolitical vision is that the Eurasian center attracts the periphery to dominate the former. If the game of world politics is in Eurasia, you have to go there, could be an accepted statement. But what happens when it is not like that, but the opposite? This is what has been happening almost immediately after the moment in which Brzezinski published his famous book in 1996. Latin America has been part of a support for this soft balancing policy practice to and from the region targeting US influence. We might consider that as a natural policy from the perspective of offensive realists like John Mearsheimer. How two Eurasian powers, China and Russia, has spearheaded their geostrategic response is striking. On the other side, of course, is Latin America itself, which from the ideological reasons in some cases, or economic reasons in others, has served as a platform in this historical geopolitical turn. I will start from my previous reflection to account for a phenomenon that has been analyzed as the length, but that deserves more attention since it is dynamic. I'm referring to the different strategies and styles of approach that China and Russia have applied in Latin America. These powers offer a good opportunity to apply some comparative methods. Despite their apparent difference, there are Eurasian powers with regimes with totalitarian historical roots, all rivals of the West, with thermonuclear weapons and permanent seats on the Security Council of the United Nations. These characteristics separate them from other Eurasian powers, such as Iran, Turkey, or Belarus, which have also tried to play the game of the great geopolitical turn. Despite these apparent similarities, we cannot ignore the difference in government formulas. China presents, well, I'm talking with the experts on China, so please help me to improve these ideas. China presents a continuity factor that has not directly with one that has to do directly with his one-party system. The Chinese Communist Party has been in power for more than 70 years, but more importantly, that continuity surpassed the end of the Cold War. The significant changes experienced in the world since 1949 have passed without seriously dividing or fracturing the party, allowing the survival of an overcrowded totalitarian system that enjoys stability. The opposite case is Russia, which after the Soviet collapse entered a decade of decline that can only be stopped, at least in appearance, with Vladimir Putin's arrival and the Second Chechen War. Thus, the collective and highly institutionalized Chinese government contrasts with the Russian personalism, which has the former diversified and manufacturing economy differs from the latter's dependence on hydrocarbons. But it will be a mistake to say that China is all stability and Russia instability and arbitrariness. At the core of every government formula lie elements that point to their opposites. Thus, the Chinese Communist Party has undergone 5 generations of leadership, 3 of them so far in the 21st century. Thus, although the party is a constant, its leadership is variable, and as evidenced by the comparison between the foreign and defense policy of Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. The first was the heir of the 4 modernizations imposed by Deng Xiaoping, and it was the tremendous commercial opening of China and its landing in Latin America. The second was the technocrat par excellence, with a clear vocation for economic growth and high energy consumption without getting into political trouble. His approach to Latin America seemed ambiguous, but it ended up being decisive in retrospection. And the third represents the assertive leadership of a confident China, sure of its privileged place in the world. It was up to each one also to face an increasingly less cohesive and less prestigious United States. In the case of Russia, the system has been anything but unstable. Putin took advantage of the oil and gas boom derived from the Chinese economic growth to revive its ailing national economy. Besides his he reinjected capital into the arms industry to supply Western rivals who are not allowed access to NATO-associated technology. That is, they took advantage of the decline in American influence. This double trend allowed Russia to complete a curious honor roll of great powers, with a dominant power that resists the decline, an ascendant that begins to be affected by the resistance, and a decadent one that is willing to take advantage of every crack to avoid international irrelevance. This condition, along with the personalization of power, has given the Kremlin cohesion, allowing it to play beyond its apparent possibilities. These differences are also manifested in Chinese and Russian approaches to Latin America. Let me start and focus about all on Venezuela and as an emblematic case of Eurasian presence in that region. As we know, the critical situation of Venezuela has overflowed its border. The massive immigration, which has led almost 20% of the population to leave the country, affects several South American states and has put hundreds of thousands of Venezuela in a vulnerable condition. This socioeconomic crisis is based on autocratization that keeps Nicolás Maduro, the political heir of Hugo Chavez, in power. Chavismo has managed to sustain his regime on two fundamental pillars: the cooptation of the armed forces and formidable external partner support. Although Cuba has been the tremendous ideological beacon and faithful support to the Bolivarian Revolution, China and Russia are the primary columns in the Venezuelan revolutionary challenge to the United States and the Western liberal order. As I have already said, the US geostrategy has had Eurasian as a primary objective. In the rescue of the Mackinder tradition, Brzezinski thus toward the end of the 20th century, it's clear that the main objective for a realist American foreign policy is to consolidate its role of an offshore balancer against the Eurasian powers, as affirmed by Mersheimer and Walt. This strategic management of Washington geopolitical goals has not always been consistent with itself. Its failing has been more by excess than by default, as evidenced by Afghanistan and Iraq wars and occupations. Returning to the offshore balancing strategy had to weigh from the arrival of Barack Obama, with a resizing of the regional commands, reduction of the central command with responsibility in the heart of Eurasia, and the strengthening of a young African command, and the launch of the Pivot to Asia initiative. These geostrategic tools joined the already established presence of the US alliance in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, fueling the idea of a tremendous surrounding movement against the greatest Eurasian rivals. The Eurasian response in the America has been an uneven, asymmetrical, but continuous process, since it is not compatible with US geostrategy in the other way around. It has had a backdrop changes in the distribution of capabilities and the notion of legitimacy in world order. On the other hand, the West's relative decline is accompanied by the rise of re-emergence of non-Western powers. The consequence of this was the deconcentration of world economic capabilities and made the possibility of generating wealth less unequal. In this context, the capacities and capabilities transformation, the Bolivarian revolution strategies identified the opportunity to start a risky but plausible game of soft balance in the United States. The maneuver consisted on a double movement that will make the Venezuelan grand strategy an exceptional Latin American case. On the one hand, an energy trade relationship with China aiming to at accumulating debt with the Asian giant. The greater the amount of the debt, the greater China's interest in preserving Venezuela's status quo. On the other hand, a technological and military relationship with Russia aimed to offsetting the consequences of a military embargo imposed by the United States. By attracting Washington's first economic rival and the principal military challenger, Chavista Venezuela entered a geopolitical game that exceeded its actual capabilities. For their part, Beijing and Moscow found in Venezuela the possibility of replicating in the Americas the offshore balancing strategy that the United States has been applying for a long time in Eurasia. Although the Chinese and the Russia have a common goal in this strategy, their conditions are different, which has differentiated their tactics and could affect their future behaviors. As we all know, China's capabilities are extraordinary. The great Asian power has been insisting on the peaceful rise thesis for almost a generation in the deliberate interest of avoiding a violent power transition. China's economic growth has come with the Beijing increased interest in world political affairs. Venezuela is one of those issues. Chinese energy demand was one of the factors driving the commodity supercycle. In China's relationship with Venezuela, this implies a process of progressive substitution of the US market. Thus, Sino-Venezuelan relationship has based on fundamental economic interests from the Chinese side. China's decision-making structure was, for most of that relationship, a moderating factor. Under Yan and Hu, China's assertiveness always had a natural counterbalance in its political command structure, with its collective nature and multiple economic interests. But Xi changed the rules of the game. Since late 2017, Xi has expanded his power by changing the control mechanism. According to Elizabeth Economy, since he came to power in 2013, the fifth generation leader of the Chinese Communist Party has been experimenting with new forms of political power centralization. However, this was only consolidated with the changes introduced at the party 19th Congress in 2017, which left the door open for Xi's indefinitely continued future. Moscow continues to depend on its past. Russia's international power and status remain a function of capabilities inherited from the Soviet Union. On the one hand, material capabilities in terms of conventional weapons and largest nuclear arsenal. Also, energy infrastructure and a network of oil and gas pipelines allow it to exploiting its hydrocarbons and being the natural path of a large part of those exported from the former Soviet space. On the other hand, from an Asian-focused perspective, Vladimir Putin itself, the architect of restoring Russian relevance, is a surprise relic of the Cold War. It is not easy to replace Russia on the map of the great power in a strict sense. Everything indicates that it is halfway between being a competent regional power and a declining world power. As Moscow's relationship with Caracas progresses on the other side of the world, Russia is more of a decaying power that resists irrelevance. That does not limit its important impact on the Venezuelan and the Latin American realities. In a dozen years, Russia became Venezuela's first arms supplier, although the region attention has been primarily on the 24 Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets and the 92 T-72 tanks, as well as a large number of MI series transport helicopters. The security analyst Andrei Servin-Pont affirms that the new Venezuelan arsenal real risk is its anti-aircraft power. Of course, the S-300 system stand out, but the real threat will be in the thousands of portable soil-to-air systems that will be in the hands of the Venezuelan armed forces and that run to the risk of spreading throughout Latin America. Beyond this scenario of extreme regional insecurity, Russia has been assertive, diversifying its presence in Venezuela. Through the state-owned Rosneft, their investment and loans made the Russians surpass the Chinese in oil exploitation of the Orinoco Belt. But these financial maneuvers for energy commercialization purpose have no to come along, and neither has the relationship in the arms trade. Russia and Venezuela have woven a web of corruption ties that has created a complex fabric beyond classical geopolitics. Alejandro Cardoso Uzcategui and I have written about this. These presences have contributed to the persistence of an increasingly authoritarian regime, decoupled from the West and its liberal order, and also from Latin America itself and its aspiration for democracy and development. But although the objective so far has been predictable for both powers, China and Russia differ in loyalty. On one side, there is the command and decision-making structure. Although it is still more complex in China's case, is not less accurate that the Xi government has been showing a greater concentration of power and foreign ideological projection. This trend favors the Maduro government, while the Chinese executive can continue to interpret that Venezuela can be a key piece in the geopolitical chess against the United States, despite the Bolivarian Revolution economic failure. Although the centralization of the Chinese command tips the balance in favor of the continuity of Chavismo, it is still true that the great Chinese strategy has been designed long before Xi. The peaceful rise thesis continued to be valid in a grand strategy that aims at economic hegemony and the avoidance of unnecessary confrontations. On the other side, Russians fear as a declining power contrasts with the calm with which China can make its calculations. China is an essential power for the world economy. This marked difference between powers with presence and a future, and another that desperately tries to extend its language's power, can be a rudimentary indicator of the Eurasian powers' loyalty towards the Chavista Venezuela. This explanation of China and Russian position in Venezuela fails to completely clarify their position throughout Latin America. Still, it does tell us about long-term geopolitical objectives. The predominant explanation, as we can see, is that the geostrategic positioning. Thus, Chinese policy toward Latin America will correspond to the interest of undermining the power basis of the main rival in its region in response to the US presences in Southeast Asia, the Korean Peninsula, and Japan. It is manifest with the sale of anti-riot weapons that Evan Ellis, Benjamin Kreuzfeld, and I have highlighted in the China-Venezuela relationship, which is complemented by the participation of the Chinese CTE in the development of Maduro Homeland Guard. The K-8 combat aircraft were used in the military aviation of Venezuela over a week ago in their combats with dissidents from the FARC guerrilla in Apure State, border with Colombia. We could also mention Chinese aerospace-based project in Argentina, which has been controversial due to the secrecy and the restriction on the Argentine armed forces. With this, we can accept that concerning the Americas, China wants to play offshore balancer, which will be consistent with the thesis of offensive realism and the general framework of the power transition. Russia, for its part, plays similarly, although not from a perspective of transition of power, but of declining power that try to maintain its relevance. For Moscow, the arms sale to Latin America is an essential tool of influence. Although Caracas is the fifth largest buyer of Russian weapons in the last 2 decades, this is not limited to Venezuela. Surprisingly, Colombia is also a client of the post-Soviet Russian military-industrial complex. And I say surprisingly because Iván Duque's Colombia has reported improper activities by Russian diplomats in Bogota. These activities will be linked to the Russian, Cuban, and Venezuelan intelligence agencies. However, in the last 25 years, Colombia has acquired 25 Mi-8 and Mi-17 transport helicopters. Let's discard the 10 that the government of Ernesto Samper bought, since he was a president with a bad relationship with Washington. However, there is still 15 operational helicopters that receive Russian maintenance, which was acquired by the architect of the Plan Colombia, Andrés Pastrana, and the executor of democratic security policy, Álvaro Uribe Vélez. In one case and the other, we see how these loose pieces of information point to geostrategy that concurs in soft balancing the United States in the Western Hemisphere. But I'm also convinced that there are for-profit corporate and individual actors in the Chinese and Russian governments. I propose that we think about the dominant geostrategic explanation and a complementary geoeconomic one. Since Edward Luttwak works, we understand geoeconomics as the science that studies the spatial and economic aspect of natural resources, those material goods provided by nature and the national economies. In the case of China, this is more than habit. In the days of Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao, China showed all its appetite for raw materials beyond Africa. Together with the geopolitical conjunctures, this appetite fueled the boom in raw materials, from which the Latin American governments profit enormously between 2004 and 2014. China's hunger has stabilized, but its energy diet does not show significant alterations today. That should call our attention on the fact that Beijing required a constant flow of import food and hydrocarbons. And in this sense, most South American countries, especially Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Peru, have China as their leading trading partner, displacing the United States. In contrast, it has been said that while China does business, Russia acts politically. The evidence in the last decade show us that those roles are not static. As I have told you, China is in a more than just a large commercial operation in Latin America, and Russia and the fabric of its mafia state go beyond the geopolitical. Thus, for example, Russia's Rosneft and its heir, the security service company RN Okrana Resign, have played an essential role in the commercialization of Venezuelan oil in the face of a collapse of the state-owned PDVSA. In Venezuela itself, the Siloviki, those former intelligence agents over military officers, have ventured into business ranging from banana cultivation to civil engineering through mining in recent times. This wide range of Sino-Russian interests in Latin America tell us something clearly. Beijing and Moscow came to America to stay. We are talking about governmental interests linked to interpretation of the national interests that merge public and private goals. It is in this context that we must understand that in Latin America, there is not simply an accident of convergence and opposition among great powers, but that is the region has wholly entered into the interests that articulate the subsystem of the great powers. It is already having consequence with the geostrategic and geoeconomic presence of Iran and Turkey, as well as the growing economic interests of some Indian energy and mining companies. In this conference, I have focused mainly on external interests, emphasizing the observed state, China and Russia, and the United States. But what does this new geopolitical normal mean for Latin America? Well, first of all, I'm going to highlight the advantages. The first and foremost of this is autonomy. Roberto Rosell and Juan Gabriel Tocatlián have highlighted autonomy as a goal desired by most Latin American states, although not all of them always share this goal, nor do most then achieve it. This autonomy derives directly from the association alternative available to Latin American governments, both from their commercial business and their diplomatic alignments. For Latin America, the rise of China and Russia reemergence have brought a more permissive world. I prefer to avoid the term multipolar, not only because it's a cliché and absurd word, but because, strictly speaking, we are not in a multipolar world, but in a bipolar one. Before appealing to polarity, I prefer a more complex category, such as the concentration or deconcentration, if you like, by Edward Mansfield, which refer to the potential international dynamism underneath the game of great powers. But let me go further by associating them, the term autonomy, with what neoclassical realists like Riesman, Talafierro, and Lovell define as an international permissiveness. This expansion in the framework for Latin American action is the main advantage that China and Russia participation in the Americas affairs have brought. But not all are good news. While economic and political autonomy is a grand strategic goal for the weak and stable Latin American state, also is the democratic aspiration. For many of the most important Latin American countries, the end of the Cold War brought with the triumph of the liberal values that materialize in the legitimation of democracy and human rights as essential political principles. The free market did not manage to join that set of values, of course. But the Sino-Russian incidents is a risk that we must not overlook. The most recent data from the VDEM and the Freedom House show a recessive trend in democracy in the world. Marina Canoyer and Thomas Demmelhuber have demonstrated that existence of authoritarian knowledge transfer networks through international cooperation. Regionally, these are known as authoritarian centers of gravity. But we could also think of global authoritarian hubs in which those lessons on how to contain democratic projects are disseminated. I believe that to the extent that Russia is politically assertive to support its allies, especially Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, it is looking to affect its adversary with propaganda maneuvers, especially to the besieged Colombian democracy. Thus, there will be the possibility of weakening Latin American democratic institutions. In parallel, China is increasingly determined to openly express its authoritarian political values, which could go with its investment and loans to the region, also vaccines. In closing, I want to reflect on the ideas I have shared today and want to consider a paradox. On the one hand, colleagues such Luis Escanoni and Andrés Malamud point out that Latin America has been losing relative international relevance for at least a century. I have no doubts about it, not only because of the evidence that Escanoni and Malamud share, but because in my observation and estimate, I have seen this. Furthermore, when we compare Southeast Asia, growth, and different sub-region of sub-Saharan Africa, we can understand why the United States has spent less in the Southern Command and more in other geographic commands. However, the increasingly active presence of Eurasian power in Latin America poses a challenge for the United States, Latin American states, and the West in general. Consequently, we may be facing a paradox of Latin American geopolitical relevance, making us rethinking the region's place and importance in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Victor, for this fascinating presentation. This product that you're raising is obviously something that we may discuss, as well as many key points that you underlined during your presentation. So we will first leave the floor to our two experts on influence, and then we will open the floor to the audience after the questions and remarks by Antoine Mondaz. So please, Emmanuel, would you like to start?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Maud. Thank you very much, Victor, for this enlightening presentation. I have to say that I'm not a bona fide expert on Latin America and Venezuela. So I learned a lot. Muchas gracias. I really enjoyed your view of Russia's selectorate dynamic in the region, opposed to a more unified approach promoted by Beijing, which I understand, if I'm correct, as a political driven strategy by Moscow versus a more pragmatically driven policy by China. I have a few questions and very quick comments. So to start, two questions on Venezuela. First, it seems that one of the main drivers of Moscow support to the Maduro regime, to the Chavez regime, and later on to the Maduro regime, was to prevent it from collapsing, to prevent another regime change, another color revolution that the Kremlin is above all afraid of. If you look at the way the Kremlin is describing this so-called color revolution in the former Soviet Union, so in Ukraine, in Georgia, or in Libya, or the Arab Spring. So if you can elaborate a bit more on this point. Second, it appears that in Venezuela, and maybe you will disagree with me, so it's an open discussion, but it appears that in Venezuela, which was the backbone of Russian influence in Latin America, Beijing is progressively occupying the positions Moscow held previously, as both Russian arms sales and trade turnover between Moscow and Caracas are decreasing in favor of China. So what is your take on the potential Russian-Chinese competition in this country? So for my very few comments, which are more for like maybe the broader regional perspective, they are mainly related to Moscow's ability to genuinely achieve significant breakthrough in this battle of influence in Latin America. As a matter of fact, Russian influence in Latin America seems pretty limited, mainly because Russia does not really enjoy in this particular region the usual assets it relies in other parts of the world. So, for instance, one of the main drivers of the Russian comeback, of the Russian influence in the Middle East and in Africa lies in what I call its defense diplomacy. As these two regions, they offer numerous opportunities for this defense diplomacy to actually come to fruition, such as ongoing armed conflicts in which Russia has been involved for years now through its regular armed forces, for instance, in Syria, or its so-called private military companies in Syria, in Libya, and now in several sub-Saharan African countries, such as Mozambique, the Central African Republic, or Sudan. A strong demand for Russian weaponry, which has been combat-proof in Syria, also explains this success of Moscow defense diplomacy in this both region, in Africa and in the Middle East, with growing arm exports from Russia to the Middle East and to Africa over the past 10 years. Third, another major driver of Russian interest in boosting its presence in the Middle East and to a lesser extent in Africa lies in domestic, I would say, domestic security consideration, which are mainly related to how to prevent the threat from international terrorism to hit the Russian Federation. That was a really important driver of Russian policy, of Russian intervention in Syria, and now in other countries in the region. With regards to Latin America, I don't really see any of these incentives. On the one hand, it is true, as you mentioned, that Russia has become one of the region's largest foreign arms supplier. But first, the extremely vast majority of the weapon, I think about 70%, has gone to Venezuela. So it's very focused on one country. And I think the second country, it's mostly Nicaragua, and then Colombia, Peru, as you said. Second, I would say, but maybe you can also disagree, that arms sales should not be seen only as like grand strategy, but also as like business as usual. It's also just about making money, and exporting Russian weapons has been a very good way for the Russian authorities to do so, because Russian weapons are relatively cheap and of good quality. And third, apart from arms sales, it seems that this Russian defense diplomacy has little to offer to Latin American countries. There are currently no armed conflict in the region for Russia to get involved in. And moreover, if I'm correct, but you're the expert, so most of the Latin America countries have comprehensive defense and also homeland security partnership programs with the US, and not with Russia. Venezuela and Cuba may be set aside. Another important dimension of this limited prospect of Russian influence in the region is that Russia, unlike China, has little to offer to Latin America countries, especially from a purely economic perspective. The Russian GDP is about 1/15, I think, of the Chinese GDP, does not match at all Russia's global ambitions. And for instance, there is no Russia-based financial institution aimed at facilitating loans from Russia to Latin America countries, such as the Chinese Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Let me here remind some figures that the Russian annual foreign direct investments in the region is about $10 million compared to $10 billion from China. So maybe just to conclude, because I don't want to take too much time. I think there would be a lot of questions. I would just say that compared to other parts of the world, such as the Middle East or Africa or even Asia now, Russian influence in Latin America is fairly limited, and I even see a drop in this influence. For instance, compared to the late 2000s and the creation of the BRICS format, it looked like Russian policy towards the whole subcontinent has become less ambitious, while in some specific countries, such as Venezuela, Russian influence, to my opinion, so once again, it's a discussion, has been decreasing in favor of a stronger Chinese blueprint. So that were my comments on your fascinating presentation, Victor, and thank you again.
Many thanks, Emmanuel, for this first set of questions. Perhaps we can let Victor answer and take Maxime's questions, then that would be certainly complementary, not the same bias. So Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emmanuel, for these remarks and more than question remarks and some ideas that let me think a little bit further about this, especially this relation of Russia with Latin America. I totally agree with this idea of Russia getting involved in countries like Venezuela, trying to help the regime to avoid the change, especially because in the case that the interpretation of Caracas about this particular support of the US to the Juan Guaido's government fit perfectly in this narrative of the color revolution, but with some important differences, considering that this is not typically in Latin America, but it fits perfectly in this narrative from Caracas, and especially in Havana, and of course in Moscow. This looks like this kind of operation of change regime trying to mobilize the population. I think most of the one of the most important issues here is, of course, the support of the Russian government, especially the diplomatic support, and some kind of deterrence capabilities provided by Russia. But in the end, I think this is more part of the strategy and capabilities of how to avoid the change regime, the regime change in Venezuela is part of the un-Chavista strategy. Mm-hmm. from 2002, after the Chavez coup. Chavez was removed from power from some hours, and after that he tried to be clear in how to control three particular aspects of the Venezuelan life. First of all, the armed forces, how to control the armed forces from the party. So we have here civilian control over the military, but in a revolution way. The second issue was how to control the media. And Chavez playing all this idea of very Gramscian idea about communication hegemony. And the third issue was how to control completely the oil industry. So taking this control, I think Venezuela have developed its own strategy to avoid any kind of change, of regime change. But of course, the support of Russia, diplomatic support of Russia, the energy support of Russia, helping Venezuela to commercialize part of this oil flying under the radar of the sanctions is also helpful for the Maduro's regime.
The visits, and I think more importantly, RTN in Spanish seems to develop an anti-imperialist and anti-neoliberal editorial line, which you have probably noticed, Victor, which is of course very critical also of US interventionism, and which aims to capture the attention of mostly of leftist audiences on the continent, while remaining also compatible with Russia's foreign policy in the region. So you have clearly here a Soviet discursive or narrative heritage, we can say, and also we can observe here an important distinction with the European branches of these two Russian transnational networks, which are more in line with the right-wing and sovereigntist political line. For example, you may know that the former president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, presented a TV show on RT between 2018 and 2020, and he invited the main radical left and left-wing leaders of Latin America. And Venezuela, once again, I think is a good case study here, because you have former figures close to the Venezuelan regime that are active contributors of RT and Espanol. I think about Eva Gollinger, for example, or Alfredo Serrano Mansilla. And you have also RT in Spanish cooperating with the Venezuelan TV network, which is very Bolivarian in its editorial line, Telesur, and which has also which also strongly relies on this anti-imperialist message. The coverage also of the political crisis in Venezuela has been generally favorable to the Maduro regime and focused more on the risk of US interference in the region by raising the risk of a new Monroe Doctrine, for example, rather than on the anti-governmental demonstrations or the repression by the police, which is something that they usually do in the US or European countries, as we have seen in France with the coverage of the Yellow Vest movement, for example. And also to remain, and I finish here, in the information sphere, but more in its more subversive dimension, you have perhaps seen that the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a few days ago a report in which they advance in the continuation of previous works, actually, that Russia has recently outsourced its influence operation to various companies, to various third countries' nationals, including in Ghana and in Mexico, precisely to interfere and to spread disinformation content among African American citizens in the case of Ghana and Latino Americans in the US in the case of Mexico. So my question, Victor, perhaps as a Colombian citizen and more importantly as a Spanish speaker, which is not my case, could you perhaps elaborate on this side of Russia's presence, especially on the media and informational aspect of it? If you watch RT, for example, I don't know, I would be really interested to have your view on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. Victor?
May I? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Maxime, for your question, for your observation, and for following me in Twitter. So, totally agree again. I think, yeah, this is maybe the most important advantage of Russia over China, and Russia is trying to exploit this, considering that they don't have the financial power of China to have this broad economic strategy on Latin America. So that's the reason why they try to be have a more important presence in these alternative spaces of discussion in Latin America. But also, well, I would like to connect some dots here, because part of my current research about petrostates, particularly, I'm particularly taking into account this kind of investment in global media, especially the case of Russia Today. But we can see how Russia Today, Telesur, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, all of are part of this grand communication strategy from petrostates, trying to capitalize this oil boom in the first and second decade of the 21st century. In the case of Russia Today, of RT, of course, they have shown how they have this open interest in being part of the Latin American debate, political debate, not in any particular country, but in all the countries, considering that, you know, this narrative of this is, you know, some imperialist puppets against those freedom fighters or democratic fighters on the side of these left wing and more radical left wings in Latin America. Sometimes it is also contradictory, considering that most or part of the messages from Moscow sometimes could be labeled as right-wing messages, you know, radical nationalism, or even homophobic, or, you know, against of all these new agendas. But in Latin America, they took only part of these messages, considering how to target the Western, especially the US messages and policies in Latin America. In the case of Russia Today, and your question is about how, you know, the influence of Russia Today in Latin America or in countries like Colombia. In some countries in Latin America, Russia Today RT is forbidden. You cannot, because the government of Macri in Argentina, now Fernandez has already opened this policy, but Macri in Argentina, or Santos and Duque in Colombia, their governments forbidden the RT in the public television, part of the, you know, the open television, the open air television, because For them, this is a part of the propaganda strategy of Russia, trying to diminish the democracy in Colombia, trying to make some kind of, you know, cheering policies from Cuba and Venezuela, and attacking directly the Colombian elite and the Colombian connection with the US and the Colombian way of life, and of course. But also, it's not only this public position of the Colombian government or some other governments in Latin America, but also some kind of, you know, less public positions in the Colombian state. For instance, the Colombian intelligence direction is pretty much interested in how is Russia operating in Colombia. And we have this expulsion of the expelling two former diplomats that were accused of having some kind of irregular activities in Colombia. But then we have this situation with the vaccine, this situation with the Sputnik vaccine, and how Colombia showed their interest in having this vaccine as a part of its vaccination program, considering COVID-19. And I don't have any kind of information about this, but I'm trying to connect in the dots. And after that negotiation of Colombia and Russia for the Sputnik vaccine, all this case of the two diplomats now is not part of the agenda, is not in the media, is not part of the discussion. So I think that could be interesting, this combination of soft power, cultural diplomacy, information policy, but also vaccine policy, in order to have more important and more impact in Latin American societies and Latin American politics. And it is the case of Russia with the Sputnik vaccine, and also the Chinese Sinovac, who is also well received by Latin Americans, especially in countries like Colombia. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you very much, Maxime.
Many thanks to both of you. I think we are going to switch narratives, because there's a wide range of tools of influence that have been mentioned both by Emmanuel and Maxime. Most of them were the one used by Russia, but obviously the aim of this session was to compare the two main giants, Russia and China, in Latin America. We have many questions on the chat for to go a little bit further about this particular Chinese influence in Latin America. But first, Antoine, I'm sure that you have many questions and remarks for Víctor, and perhaps different views on Chinese presence, aims, goals, and tools in the region. The floor is yours, Antoine. Many thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will try to be quite brief and touch upon at least 4 issues. The 4 issues would be the opportunities actually for Southern American and Latin American countries in dealing with China. The second one on the question of Taiwan, because it's a very specific question in that region. Then, of course, a big question about the US, and then a very tiny question on the vaccine. Just some brief element from the Chinese perspective. For sure, Latin America and the Caribbean have grown a lot in terms of importance, despite of the distance. That's something that most people do not realize, but the capital country that is further away from Beijing is Buenos Aires, because it's 19,000 kilometers away from Beijing, much further away than any countries in Africa, in Europe, etc. So it's actually close if you check the Pacific Ocean, but it's actually very far away from China. Yet, Chinese importance in the region and Chinese investment in the region have grown a lot since 2008 and the first white paper in China, Latin America. That white paper was actually updated in 2016 2 years after the launch of the Latin America and Caribbean China Summit. It was in 2014. And ever since, bilateral relation has been flourishing. In terms of trade, in 20 years, over the last 20 years, it grew from 10 billion to more than 300 billion, and there are more and more communication on the Chinese side on these aspects. But I think there is something very specific in terms of trade between China and Latin America, is that most of trade relies actually on raw resources. Something like 3/4 of the trade, actually of Chinese imports from Latin America are raw resources, when overall in the Chinese imports, it's only 27%. So that's something very, very specific in China, Latin America trade relation. And one of my questions is, do you see any evolution on that? Do you see that we see that with the Belt and Road Initiative, because Latin America is de facto part of it, because there are some 20 countries that are from Latin America and the Caribbean that have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you see, let's say, maybe a rebalance of these trade exchanges? China is maybe focusing a bit less on raw resources, natural resources, and maybe more on, I don't know, like consumer goods, services, etc. And what could be the opportunity actually for all these Latin American and Caribbean countries? My second point is on the issue of Taiwan. It's very important because Taiwan, I mean, the Republic of China, Taiwan, has 15 diplomatic relations left, 14 countries plus the Vatican, but almost these 14 countries, 9 of them are in the region. So 4 in Central America, Paraguay, and 4 in the Caribbean. For sure, Beijing has been trying a lot to suppress these diplomatic relations with some success. Panama in 2017, Dominican Republic and El Salvador in 2018. Do you see any more pressure? And how will it fit the US-China relations? Because something was voted actually by the Congress and de facto accepted by by Trump president as at the end of this mandate, so-called the Taipei Act. The Taipei Act makes it actually easier for the US diplomat to pressure a country that would shift relations from Taipei to Beijing, or to give incentives for these countries with diplomatic relations with Taiwan not to shift relations. And how do you see, especially for these countries, how they could leverage actually that US-China confrontation? A third aspect, quite fast on the US, of course, because that's the big actor. So far, Chinese influence, of course, is growing in Latin America, but in terms of security and military, it's quite limited. Chinese arms sales to the region are limited to around like 100 million US a year. It's not a lot if you compare it to Chinese export, of course, to Pakistan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. But do you see any evolution in terms of security partnership between China and these countries? Also a lot of concern on the US side on some form of scientific cooperation between China and these countries, including with Argentina, with de facto the Space Observation Center in Patagonia in Las Lajas, that actually attracted a lot of concern from the US because that Space Observation Center could be used at the end of the day for military purposes. So how do you see this in terms of, from the US side, but also from the Latin American countryside, in terms of security and military? Also in terms of perception, do you see any deterioration in terms of perception on China? I'm not sure that China has been very good in soft power in their region, but for sure the US has not, including there is a Trump administration. And if I give just the figure from the Pew from 2019, because they're the only one I have that are updated, 2019, the favorable views from the Brazilians to China is 51%. 50% from the Mexicans, and 47% from the Argentinians. It was much lower in the US, 26%, and even in France, 33%. And it has deteriorated a lot in 2020 and 2021. So how do you say, I would say this kind of struggle influence in terms of image from the US and China in these countries. And last but not least, in terms of vaccine, from a European perspective, we have focused a lot on Africa, maybe too much, but a lot was going on in Southeast Asia and in Latin America, including the mega contract ordered by Brazil with the Chinese Sinopharm for more than 100 million doses. But what is quite interesting is that no country in the region have been relying only on Chinese vaccine. Even Chile, that has imported a lot of Chinese vaccine, has also diversified with AstraZeneca and others. How do you see this specific use of the vaccine diplomacy of China and the influence? And it's all the more important since China in its last 5 years plan and all this kind of strategy has been focusing a lot on emerging economies, developing economies, much more than developed economies. And if as Europeans we focus mostly once again on Africa, I think it would be very interesting for us as Europeans to also be a bit more aware of what's going on in Latin America. It's of course not only for the Portuguese and the Spanish, but also for the whole European Union to further discuss it, especially when we discuss also the potential agreement with Mercosur. I'm not sure it's gonna end up in any agreement, but for sure Chinese influence in the region has a growing impact for the European interest. So once again, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antoine. So we can see that the interest for Latin America is not declining for European research fellows. Many thanks for that. And Victor, the floor is yours. We'll have questions from the chat.
Okay, can you hear me, right? Okay, thank you very much, Antoine, for your question and your remarks on this issue. Well, the evolution of raw materials and natural resources to a more complex relationship in terms of economic interchange. Sadly, I can see that. I can see this evolution to a more complex relationship. I think all the opposite, you know, more dependency of Latin America to China as the new economic center. The new, you know, dependency theory is again, you know, coming through in Latin America to be an issue, an important issue, considering that the new center now in China, and some other countries, of course, but China is helping to the growth, but not helping to the complex of these Latin American economies. For a while, sometimes people talk about, you know, the possibility of move some Chinese companies, some branches to Latin America, including, you know, the presence of new, you know, of offices and permanent representation of these companies in Latin America. But for now, this representation is quite small. Even though this company that is starting this work of the construction of the Bogota subway is not, they have not this permanent location here in Bogota. So so far what I see is more or less the same pattern with you know, the reproduction of what happened into Latin America in its relation with Europe, and then with the US, and now with China. You know, being part of the margins of this central economy, with you know, providing natural resources, providing raw materials, but not providing specific or you know, manufacture or services to the Chinese economy. In the case of Taiwan, this is a very interesting question, because now the former representative of Taiwan interests in Colombia moved to Paraguay in order to reinforce the presence of Taipei in Paraguay, because Paraguay is now a kind of, you know, pivot in this Taiwanese diplomacy. But 2 days ago, the president of Paraguay announces this interest in have a more close relationship with China in order to get these advantages to get the vaccine. So the vaccine diplomacy and of course, vaccine and investment in Paraguay is an important issue for its president. And I have no idea how is reacting Taiwan right now, considering this, because this is a breaking news, but they are making some pressure on this government in order to have this recognition of one China policy. And how the Latin American countries deal with the US-China confrontation, this is maybe the question, the most important question in this consideration of power transition here in Latin America, because so far we don't have any important clashes among China and the US here in Latin America, at least. Maybe the distance that you remark is an important issue that make Latin America, being far from these particular tensions between among China and the US. But the preferred strategy is to maintain some kind of, cordial relation with both parties. That's not the case, of course, of Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua or some other countries or some oppositions, especially left oppositions in Latin America. But for most of the countries, they try to have this central position between these two powers. If there is security partnership with Latin American countries, the perception of China and the US, well, the security partnership is pretty particular because China is not this, is not an important actor in terms of providing hardware to Latin American countries, except the only exception is Venezuela, of course. But the presence of the military industrial complex in Venezuela is much larger than the Chinese one. But in the case of China and Latin America, I think maybe those cases, Venezuela and Argentina in the second place. Venezuela is already using some aircraft from China, the K-8, but also the radar system. And they are using the Chinese tridimensional radar system in order to bring information to the air-to-soil platforms of the Russian S-300. So they have this connectivity with the Chinese radars, with the Russian air defense system, and obtaining some kind of, knowledge transmission, knowledge about how to use this technology. In the case of course, and the uses of vehicles to anti-riot vehicles. In the case of Venezuela, they were, used in 2017. The infamous white, armed vehicles. In Venezuela, they call that tanqueta china, these impressive vehicles in order to crush any kind of riots in Caracas street and some other cities. But maybe the most important is the CTE participation. Now this is a kind of forgotten project, but it's part of this idea of the Maduro regime of have this biometrical control over the population to control, how people can access to food, access to medicine, access to public services with this ID, Carnet de la Patria, with a chip provided by CTE. In the case of Argentina, we have this, of course, the Argentina government say this is part of this civilian technological cooperation, international cooperation with China. But also there are some voices in Argentina, particularly, that say that this is hurting the national interests of Argentina because they don't have complete control about these bases. And of course, we have this position of the United States saying that this could be used as a base for the as a aerospace base for the space program of China, and even for the practice of some, air defense hardware there in Patagonia. So we have some opacity here. We have, of course, this, the Chinese and the US opposition is used in Latin America as a part of this political polarization. Also, in the case of Russia, the polarization in which they use, the opposition, most of the opposition and some governments like Nicaragua, Venezuela, use the image, the damaged image of the US after Trump to say, well, the United States is not only, a traditional imperialist country, but also has a poor responsibility in order to get, a frankly policy towards Latin America. So they're trying to use this connection with China and Russia, as I say in my conference, to get some autonomy, to get some alternatives in terms of not only economics, but also strategic alternatives in the world. And talking about the vaccine diplomacy, one interesting thing I see is that I think Maxime already mentioned that, is China and Russia are participating in many vaccination programs here in Latin America, but the Russian propaganda is more powerful and more has a better performance than the Chinese one. We can see how China, I don't know if it is part of the strategy, I don't know if it's poor performance in propaganda issues or part of the strategy, trying to just selling the vaccine, having influence over the government, but not having these particular presences in the public opinion. Nobody talk about, the Chinese vaccine is not a controversial issue in Latin America, but the Sputnik, it is. It's a controversial issue. And I think this is linked to this propaganda, linked to this outspoken position of the Russian government, and linked to this more discreet policy of China in Latin America. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Victor. Many thanks, Antoine, for your participation and questions. And we are going to stay a little bit on the Chinese presence competing with the US in Latin America. One first question was about petro powers and the fact that a few countries are able to refine Venezuelan petrol. And the question was, will China be able to take this task and disqualify the US in the near future? Victor, do you think you could answer?
Yeah, but I don't understood the question.
Okay, sorry.
When we talk about petrol, we were talking about oil, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Good. Exactly. Well, so will China be able to take this task and disqualify the US in the near future?
No, I think they have no interest on this, because China already had all these licenses to use Venezuelan technology in order to refine extra heavy oil from the Orinoco belt. And this technology is orimulsion. This orimulsion is a technology that competes directly with coal, not with oil, but with coal, in order to produce electricity. It's a very heavy technology. It's a very I don't know. It's not a clean technology, of course, but it's useful in order to get cheap energy. But now China is not interested in that kind of business, refining Venezuelan oil or refining oil in their soil. But we have here a new actor in this connection with Venezuelan oil, and that actor is India. And now we see these Indian companies. Mm-hmm. India is is one of the most important refiners of oil in the world. And the Indian companies, in cooperation with the Russian companies, are taking part of now the small part of this Venezuelan oil, moving through a sanctioned radar and putting this oil in India, considering that they announced, they registered this oil as a Russian oil, not as a Venezuelan oil. So Russian production, going to Indian refinery and then moving through to China. So China is not in that business, but Indian companies and Russian companies are.
Great, many thanks for that particular answer. Perhaps to come back to your presentation, there was one question raised by the audience about what you said about China and power transition and the role that Latin America would play. And in comparison, you were saying that Russia seems to appear a bit on China and power transition in its relation to Latin America, and Russia at a declining power, please.
Of course. As you know, these power transition theories say that we have this established power, a rising power, and in that point, they may go to a conflict. Sometimes this could be, a violent conflict. And we have this situation in the case of China and the US, but we have a third party, and this third party is Russia. Russia has no the economic might that has the United States or China, but they're trying in Latin America to be the third party, to be, a great power, using this propaganda power, using this military technology in order to create some kind of, tripolar order in which we have three extra powers in Latin America, extra regional powers in Latin America. The first power is this established powers, this natural connection of the United States with Latin America, with some, with some special relationships with some countries in the region, especially with Colombia. Colombia is a global partner of NATO. And have this special relationship with the United States. So United States with this established position, but losing terrain in front of this economic presence of China, that is, this rising power with a very small military presences, very small security and defense issues involved in Latin America, but very active in terms of economic and business and diplomacy, especially considering that they're trying to make some pressure in order to advance in its policy about Taiwan. And also we have this third party, that is Russia. Russia as a competitor, but not in terms of military power or energy power or economic power, but in terms of communication power, in terms of being this alternative narrative in order to refreshing this anti-imperialism, anti-American discourse in Latin America, and being part of the national agenda and the national discussions in Latin America. Russia is trying to use these new tools from globalization, social networks, and now the vaccine, that's very important. This is a very important strategy of Russia in order to get a space in Latin America. I know Russia is doing this in other regions, but well, of course, I'm a student lapses, and that's the reason why I say we have in this situation in which we have certain regional powers that are trying to create, they are trying to interact in this tripolar, not having any kind of important role in Latin America. The Brazil foreign policy is now in a very, they're very concentrated in their own internal problems and issues, and now we don't have a clear leader in the region, and that's America.
Okay, many thanks, Victor. Before taking perhaps another question from the audience, maybe we have some colleagues on stage who would like to react. Kevin and Camille, perhaps you had a question or reaction that you wanted to, or something that you wanted to add. The last comments by Victor. Just out of curiosity, if I may, you were talking about other type of tools, especially soft tools used in the region. You've been presenting Russia and China as a Eurasian power. And when we're thinking about Eurasian power from Europe, we are also thinking about another type of Eurasian power to Eurasia, and which is particularly influenced in Latin America. I'm thinking about Iran. And so I would have liked to know what are the linked and connection and the influence of Iranian power in the region that you've been observing, because obviously that would fit a little bit with what you were saying, and not with the fact that many powers are interested in having access to Latin America in terms of influence, and because certainly it would secure a certain number of economic and security interests, if I may say so.
Well, we can talk about the big three, the United States, Russia, and China in Latin America, and the other threes. And the other three is India. Considering that what I say, India is now part of this economic system, very concentrated in some countries, especially in Venezuela and Brazil, in which Indian companies are for many, many years buying lands in order to have food production in Latin America to export this from Latin America, from Brazil especially, to India, considering the growing of the Indian population. But in the case of Venezuela, there are, the main refiners of oil from Venezuela with, using third parties, third-party companies in order to avoid the sanctions. So first of all, India. The second, I will say, is Iran, as you say. Iran has a very important position in Latin America, but limited to some countries, especially in the case of Venezuela, Bolivia, and Argentina. In the case of Iran, that's maybe one of the most important security concerns of the US in Latin America, because according to the Pentagon, there are more than business in the relation of Iran with those Latin American countries. And there is some some remarks about the participation also of Hezbollah networks in countries like Venezuela, Paraguay, or even Argentina. This is a major issue. Iran is helping Venezuela with gasoline. You know, trying to help an ally in this condition in which Venezuela, with the most important and the biggest oil reserves in the world, has no capacity to produce gasoline. So Iran is helping Venezuela with gasoline, and there is some reports about the possibility of which Venezuela is paying this gasoline with gold. The new Venezuelan issue, the new Venezuelan business is the exploitation of gold and some other metals and minerals around the Orinoco belt, around the Orinoco region, trying to make some kind of movement to survive, to regime survival. So Iran may be part of this strategy. They used to have a very close relationship with Evo Morales, Bolivia. Then we have all this situation with, you know, with the change of government in Bolivia, and now the party, the Evo Morales party, is now again in power, and they have this renewed connection with Iran, and we have this connection of Iran with the Kirchner and part of this Peronismo in Argentina. I don't have many information about this. You know, I'm not an expert about Argentinian politics. It's quite complicated, but they have this particular connection with Iran, and some people say that it could be non-sancta relationship with Hezbollah and the Argentinian government. I have no information about this. And the third country I will say is Turkey, and Turkey is playing an important role, not only refining gold from Venezuela, but also having an important connection, air connection with Cuba, Venezuela, and Colombia. And now we have this, well, you know, before the pandemic, we have this direct flight from Bogota to Istanbul, and this flight from Caracas, Havana, Istanbul. And now we see this interesting connection between, you know, Turkey and some other authoritarian governments in Latin America. And there is an interesting connection because in the case of Hugo Chavez failed coup in 2002, April 2002, and the failed coup against Erdogan, we have some similarities. Despite the difference, you know, 15 years later, we have some similarities in terms of how to control the military, how to control the media, how to control the society, using and taking advantage of these failed operations against them. I think Turkey is playing an interesting role, not only in Europe, but also in Latin America, and is becoming in somehow a kind of, you know, new Russia. So we need more information about Russia. We need more and better information about Turkey. It's very difficult to read the government of Erdogan here in Latin America, but they're having an important presence here. They have interest in Latin America, and they are connecting, and they have this authoritarian knowledge transfer to and from Latin America, and that could be a new issue, important issue, not only for us here in Latin America, but for you there in Europe, considering the proximity and, of course, the fact that Turkey is part of NATO.
Many thanks, Victor, because your answer fits perfectly well with the interest of our audience, and answers most of the questions raised by the audience. We don't have time to take all of them, but there are some particular or more specific questions raised by the audience, and maybe our participant may ask you those questions in private. If my colleague don't have anything to add, I think we can thank you, Víctor, for your fascinating presentation. You raised many issues that are common, that are transatlantic views, not only trans-American views, and that was the purpose of this session. So thank you, because this is going to be very helpful, and we hope that we'll be keeping in touch and perhaps release a paper together, so that our the audience and our colleague here can listen again to your presentation and read a paper that we will release in a few months, if you agree. So that would help scholars to go further on those issues. Many thanks again. I think we'll have many other issues to discuss. We've opened many areas of discussion. Perhaps Kevin, would you, hi Jean-Baptiste, you're with us. Jean-Baptiste is also one member, a co-founder of this session of seminars. So maybe you can say a word just to thank Víctor, and then I will have to close the session for today. Many thanks to the discussants as well. Many thanks Emmanuel, Maxime, Antoine for being with us this afternoon. Many thanks to Camille, who is the illustration that you can fight against COVID-19 and be very you can work and have COVID-19 at the same time with no problem. So thank you, Camille, for being with us this afternoon too. Okay, Jean-Baptiste and Kevin, perhaps you wanted to add something.
No, I just wanted to thank Víctor, Mijares for covering so much ground, and also our discussants that I think really brought some very interesting and complementary insights into these questions. And you managed to cover some of the questions I had on ideology. That was very enriching, very stimulating. So thanks a lot, and thank you to also to all our participants who brought interesting questions as well.
Yes, and I'm just going to join my colleague with the thanks. I'm very happy because, as you may know, Víctor is a well-known scholar in Latin America and in other parts of the world, but in France, we still don't know very well his work, and I think we had a very good start, and I hope this is a start also for further collaboration. So thank you very much, Víctor, for this insightful presentation, and our discussion for the very enriching comments. So thank you all, and thank you, Maud, for this very good moderation.
Okay, so have a nice evening and see you soon. All the best to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.